This program is made possible by Zoho Corporation.
Hello, I'm Kamla. My guest today is Dr. Michael Merzenich. He's a teacher, scientist, entrepreneur, and an author. He is an emeritus professor for integrative neuroscience at UCSF. He's the co-founder and chief scientist at Posit Science that develops brain training software and therapies. And he's also co-founded another company that is associated with brain. Welcome to the show.
Nice to be with you, Kamala.
What a long list of achievements.
Well, I'm old.
You've done it all. And you also have a vineyard.
I do, just a little one, but it's a vineyard.
Well, how Californian.
Yeah, well, that's I am a Californian after all.
Okay, so let's start off with something that you've worked extensively on,
right.
Brain plasticity.
Right.
What is the difference between brain plasticity and neuroplasticity? Are they the same?
Well, they're the same. Well, it's a little bit more. You know, usually when we think of neuroplasticity, we think of wiring in the brain, and the brain does rewire itself. It revises its wiring every time you acquire a new ability or improve an ability. It's actually changing a lot more than that. You could say when we really engage the brain, we have a really healthy brain that's engaged in the appropriate active ways. It also alters almost everything else about the physical brain. It's all plastic, you could say.
Plastic, not in the sense that we think of plastic, but malleable.
Exactly, and you know, we used to think that the brain basically it has a period in which it can change itself in its wiring and in the composite elements in the brain, the neurons or nerve cells of the brain, when you were a baby or when you're very young, and then the brain basically came to a mature state, and now the wiring was fixed for life. And now all of the elements were mature, they'd grown up, and really the brain had only one way to go from that point forward to the end of life, and that's to deteriorate. But we now know that's completely wrong.
So the brain doesn't deteriorate, actually?
It actually continually changes itself. It's continually remodeling itself. And every time a young child learns to read, very large-scale changes occur in the brain that account for the reading to any skill. So you could think of yourself as the sum of all of that change as an operational human being, what you can do, what you're good at, what you can effectively do, is the sum of all of that change. It really creates you. It really creates you with all of your potential, all your possibility, all of the realities that define you as a person. And one of the beautiful things about it, Kamala, is that it's so complicated. And every one of our life, of course, every one of our paths in life is individual to us. And then we have our own individual, you could say, thoughts and activities internally within us. And what it does is it differentiates us. We each have a unique machine that's changed just for us, that accounts just for us, that is our machine.
What makes it unique, though?
Well, it's just made unique by the incredible complexity with which we've evolved our special set of skills and our special knowledge. So I once had a conversation with the Dalai Lama, and I said something grandiosely like, we can account now on a first level to understand the basis of the origin of our being and why we behave the way we do. And he looked at me and he said, yes, but you can never account for individual difference and the magnificence of it. And he's right, of course. The individual difference, you could say, is incredibly complicated within us. Your brain has had an incredible passage in your lifetime that's made you as a unique person. No one ever in the history of the world going forward will be just like you. No one ever was just like you, all because you've, in a sense, had the power to create this unique instrument within your skull.
So what attributes or contributes to that special you or special me or special somebody else?
Where you've
Is
been.
It social?
Sure. Where you've been and what you've learned and what your interactions would be and your human interactions and the skills that you've acquired and information resources that have flown in and the way you've manipulated information and thought in incredible, rich and complex ways in your life. So, you know, I see this as a great gift that each one of us has been given. We have this incredible power. We have the power, in a sense, to change ourselves as a function of our engagement with the world and life. for the better. At any point in time, looking forward, you could say, well, how can I continue to grow as a person? How can I continue to grow in my assets as it controls my behavior and my life?
But not everybody thinks that way. You know, we somehow...
Well, why
somewhere
don't they?
Well,
what I'm saying
I
is
don't
that...
know why we
that,
don't, but I'm asking
yeah.
you, why don't we?
Well, what I'm saying is that the science tells us, I think, that we should be thinking that way. I'd say one reason we haven't is because we tend to think of ourselves more likely or often as a sort of victim of our life or circumstance.
Or age, victim of age.
Yeah, we say that I'm here and I'm declining, or I'm here and and I've had this life. Realizing the potential for change of the person you are by changing yourself within your brain. I mean, this is a capacity that we all have. We can all be stronger next month. We can all be more capable.
How?
We can all be more, well, we have to engage our brains. We have to engage it and advantage it. So this is one of the reasons that I've contributed to the development of several companies, because I'm trying to help people use sort of modern technological strategies, simple strategies, and using contemporary technology to engage their brain to drive changes in it that would advantage them. But you can also think about it from the point of view of how to live your life to the advantage of your brain. What is your brain asking you to do? I've written a book about this. The book is called Softwired. I wrote it as a sort of source of advice to an average informed individual about how they could think about their brain from the point of view of taking care of it and advantaging it and making a stronger person, creating a stronger person, you could say, and because we all have this capacity.
Were you always fascinated with how the brain works? Because as kids, we all wonder, where did we come from?
Yeah.
Those are questions every kid has.
Yeah,
and then we forget.
Yeah. Well, in a sense, I came to that as a young man, as a student. I thought, well, this would be the most interesting thing I can think to study or to pursue if I wanted to. I knew I wanted to be a scientist as a young lad. And
how did you know you wanted to be a scientist?
Well, I guess I was just intrigued by all of the uncertainties and fascinating. And I had a background in life, and influences in life that were very science oriented.
Like?
Well, I had a grandfather that was wonderfully informed about issues, and he always asked me about relating this. I'd see some little thing, and he'd say, "Well, how does that relate to Newton's laws?" Or he'd say, "Well, something." And this is from the time I was 10, 11, 12 years old, right?
And your grandfather would observe something and say, "How does it?"
Well, he just pointed out that behind almost everything you saw or observed or that operated in the world, there was a deeper level of understanding and explanation, and I was interested in that. I was interested in
the first
how
principles.
does this work? How does this work? How could this plant do this? How could this work? And so I was one of those kids that asked that question maybe a little bit more often, and maybe just a little bit more deeply than the average kid. So I knew I wanted that it would be a privilege to study such things or to work on such things or to try to understand such things as a life profession. And I realized that I could do that was a profession. And so then as a young lad, I became very interested in, like you say, the great question, what am I? How do I think about, why do humans behave the way they do? Where do all of these problems come from that I see these people around me that are sick in the head because we'd identify their condition as a psychiatric illness or neurological problem or whatever. And I thought that it was just an incredibly interesting and fascinating thing.
Did you know anybody growing up who was mentally unwell?
I did. I had a dear aunt, my favorite aunt, who had severe epilepsy. And so I knew, and she was not, so she had these periods in which she was just totally out of control and unstable.
Did she have episodes? She
had episodes, and there were times in which it affected her more deeply across a period of time than that. And so part of it, of course, such an interest in a young person comes out of the sympathy or the interest in the people around them, because they sort of wish that there was something that could be done sometimes
to help them.
To help them.
Yeah. So your grandfather played a very key role, like you mentioned.
Oh, absolutely.
And he was somebody who said, don't accept things as they are. He continuously challenged you to think differently.
He did. He was well, first of all, he was the sort of person that you just could not listen to. You know,
Why?
He had a personality, and he spoke in a very direct way, and he loved children, and I think it's fair to say that he loved me among other children, and he saw life in an interaction with the child as being instructive. So commonly I had many endless conversations with him about many things, and it was almost always instructive. It was always, I would say, well, how does this work? And he'd say, well, what do you think? And pretty soon we're in a conversation, or maybe an argument. And I learned to argue in life with my grandfather. An argument is another way of saying I learned to understand that around almost every subject there are different ways to look at the subject that is clarifying and enlightening from the point of view of understanding it in any depth.
So there was rigor.
It's the rigor. And later when I worked with wonderful professors, great world professors and scientists, I never found anyone that was a better arguer or smarter than my grandfather. That's the truth. My grandfather is one of the 4 or 5, I met a number of Nobel laureates and great individuals in our modern society, and I never met anybody that I would say was clearly smarter than my grandfather in argument or in understanding. So what a gift for a kid to have somebody like this around in your life.
So he listened to you too?
He listened to me.
Okay. And he was self-taught, you mentioned.
He was an autodidact. He was an immigrant boy. He came to the U.S. when he was 9. He came and had an immediate requirement to work. This was in the 1890s. And he worked to help support his family. And
they came to Portland?
But he did not stop educating himself. You know, he originally immigrated to Minnesota.
Okay.
But he was an autodidact. He worked every day of his life, as far as I know, for an hour or 2 or 3 in educating himself. When he was in his 70s, he was still working an hour or 2 or 3 every day to educate himself formally. And he trained himself to be an engineer. He was a qualified engineer. He was a qualified architect. He was a licensed architect. He could build anything. He could understand any machine you can imagine just about. He had a number of inventions.
So I'm assuming that when you went out on a walk with him in Oregon, which is where you grew up,
Right.
that if you looked at a building, did he ever bring up trigonometry?
Oh, of course, all of these things were. It was always. You know, it was always instructive. That's what I would say. And the instruction came in 2 forms. It came in form of trying to get to what the scientific basis of the principle, or the mathematical basis of principle of something was, and it was sort of a teasing story. You know, what if you did it this way? Wouldn't, you know, it was to get you to try to think about something from another point of view. So, you know, you think about somebody having an apprenticeship with somebody like that as a young lad, right? And you think that, you know, I mean, come on, what a golden thing that is. So.
This is very rare. Not many people get to hang out with their grandfather
Right.
and learn from them in this instructive way.
Right.
You know, in a fun way, but you're also learning about science.
Right.
The first principles, right? Learning how to do things from.
It's true, and this is with a very busy man. You know, so this is all great generosity on his part.
What else did he teach you?
Well, one of the big mantras he had really related to his interactions with other and a consideration of other humans, and I think this partly came from his boyhood as an immigrant. But he said to me at least 1,000 times, he said, when someone comes to your door and knocks on your door, he said, before you open the door, you should understand that person will know things you don't know and will have an understanding of things you'll never understand. And he said the person will also always assume that person is worthwhile. Doesn't matter what they look like, doesn't matter he said, always assume that person is worthwhile and valuable. He said you might later discover when you know more about them that there are things about them that trouble you. But always assume and always understand that almost everyone in front of you has skills and abilities that you don't have. And this has been incredibly important to me in my own life, you could say, because modern science is team building. You know, it's all teamwork. And the understanding sort of intuitively that every trained expert in anything is valuable. You know, and it's really a matter of not of controlling them as a member of a team. It's really a matter of fully empowering their intelligence and respecting them. So I learned that principle. I learned the idea that you should always start from a position of respect with another human being.
Isn't that amazing? Because he basically didn't believe in stereotypes, from what you're telling me.
Right.
And that believe in the goodness, that every human being has some goodness, and go with that.
And I'm absolutely convinced it's true. You can't. Everyone within them has things that they know about and understand and sense and feel that in a sense are more enlightened than yours. Find those areas, and you're going to have a really good conversation with them.
And yet today we have a hard time finding that goodness.
We do. We assume the worst of people, and we assume that the person looks a little scruffy across from us, and we naturally say, this person somehow is not one of me, not valuable. This is just commonly not just wrong, but foolish. And partly, people react to you or interact with you as a function of how they're treated anyway. So you get back that sort of, commonly get back that sort of value from them.
How does compassion and empathy help in brain plasticity or neuroplasticity?
Well, first of all, it's a tremendous asset in your brain, because actually, the machinery that controls your sort of positive good spirits is really the same machinery that is controlling change. And the reason for that is that the brain's changing itself in the function of outcome. And no way is it changed more powerfully than when it rewards itself. So you can say, and you reward your brain just as strongly when you're compassionate as when you receive compassion. So actually, if you find a generous person, and you have a person that has by nature a relatively healthy brain, they're actually related, they're actually correlated. So my advice to everybody is I call it the river that flows both ways, generosity. Because you give and you receive as you give, your brain is exercised positively by being generous.
And that's very important.
That's really important, sure, absolutely. But besides, why not do it? It's better for all concerned.
That's something, again, we don't hear too often. I think 20 years ago you heard a lot more, but probably these days you don't.
Right. Well, partly it's because we're moving in a direction in our social interactions in which, even though we have much more powerful sort of superficial links, it seems to me that the real link between people and their social cognition is weakening. And more people are in sort of semi-isolation. I see more and more walking zombies on the street.
Well, I'm one too, glued to my phone, right?
We all do that.
We all do that. Right. So you grew up and went to school in Oregon.
I did.
And then what did you study there?
Well, I was a general science major. I didn't know when I was an undergraduate first whether I wanted to be a medical doctor or a scientist doctor. And I decided in my third year of undergraduate university that I wanted to be a scientist, a laboratory scientist. And so I tried to get a combination of engineering-related science, or you could say engineering and physical science and biological science. I was interested in biological science, but I understood, I think intuitively, it was a plan, that I should be mathematically informed and I should be sort of engineering informed in my
That's
outlook.
your grandfather's influence, I think.
Yeah, I think it was, because that's exactly how he thought about things. So you could be interested in biology, but you better understand how to use mathematical and sort of practical related tools to study it.
So then from there you went to the East Coast.
I did. I went to Johns Hopkins, which is a great research university, and I had the great privilege to work with a wonderful professor at that time, one of the great professors in integrative neuroscience. And
what was his name?
His name was Vernon Mountcastle.
Okay.
And he was sort of one of the lions of brain science in the world at that time.
Is that the first time you saw a brain when you went to Johns Hopkins?
Well, it's the first time I actually touched one, I guess. I
Oh.
mean, I would say I saw them before.
Oh, you had seen them before?
Yeah, but not in any practical sense.
So when you touched it, what does it feel like?
Squishy. No, it's just full of mystery. That's how would I say.
But
that,
you are deconstructing the mystery.
Yeah, well, you could say it in a primitive way. They're now probably 1 million scientific reports written about these elemental aspects, complex aspects of brain science, a tremendous mass of information. You know, I'm one laborer in the field, but there's a lot of laborers.
When you started, the field was small and there were very few laborers.
Small, and you had an ability sort of to be a master of some little part of it, which I think I was. I think I read everything that related to my subject when I was a young lad. And now that's not possible. Now the areas just exploded with information and understanding and all kinds of practical extensions that just did not apply or weren't accessible then.
And then why did you go to Wisconsin?
Well, you know, the usual path is to be trained as a scientist, and that was what happened at Johns Hopkins, and then to do an apprenticeship that shapes you.
So you finished your PhD there?
Right.
Okay.
So I went to Johns Hopkins with the idea that I wanted to study the neurological bases of the higher, more complex processes of the brain. I wanted to understand the brain as a machine as it related to the things that related to my humanity, right? So then I found the experiments that were being done there were pretty, let's say, elemental. Not that they weren't profound. They were addressing. My professor was Bernard Montcalf was deeply interested in trying to understand the basis encoding in the brain of a little moment of sensation or perception, a little moment of feeling. He wanted to understand what that represented in neurological terms, or how you could know in the brain whether one little bit of feeling was different from another. I mean, that's a pretty elemental and fundamental, but I was more interested in, you could say, trying to understand why people acted the way I was interested in the grander issues. So I went to Wisconsin because I sought training. I decided to focus in my understanding of the brain on listening and language, because I thought language was so much an aspect of the differentiating abilities that applied to the human brain.
When did that inflection enter your thinking that listening and language was important? Because you've spent all these years researching, writing your theses, PhD theses.
Right.
Then when did you make that left turn, saying...
Well, I realized as a student that it was probably a faster way to get to studying these great issues, that if I could understand something about, for example, the structure of language and how the brain could create such a thing, and how it could create the powers to read this highly rapidly changing acoustical information at high speed, and it could
you
sort
had reduced it to
okay. So I was looking for an extension to a model, you could say, that I could create some sort of grand vision or model around. That's why I went to Wisconsin, and there I worked with another group of wonderful scientists that were sort of the world's experts at studying this thing and that sort of thing and still in an animal brain, primarily in animal brains.
Okay, so this is the auditory function.
Right.
Okay, so you did your postdoc research there, and then you came back to the West Coast.
Then I came back to the West Coast, which is home, back home.
And you joined University of San Francisco.
University of
California at San Francisco, the medical department.
Right.
And there you got involved with somebody who had a primitive listening device.
A cochlear implant model.
A cochlear implant,
right.
Yeah. And that's where you made your first big contribution.
Well, I was also studying in parallel with that. I was studying the organization of the auditory brain, the listening brain, because I was trying to understand. I was trying to create all the underpinnings to doing the experiments I was talking about, which are more behaviorally oriented. But in the meantime, there was a surgeon there. He was actually from Redwood City, and
not far from here.
No, named Robin Michelson, and he'd implanted these devices, these cochlear implants, simple, primitive things, in the inner ear of deaf patients, and he kept coming to me. He came to me see me once a week for a good part of a year, saying, "Help me, help me, help me." But whenever he explained what he was doing and why he was doing it, I realized that, first of all, I liked him enormously. He was a great fellow, but he had not the slightest idea what he was doing. And actually, it seemed to me that what he was doing was quite impractical, and he certainly explained how it could work, or what in ways that to a card-carrying scientist were unbelievable. So at some point, I said to him, at this point, I'd become very fond of him. I said, "Robin, bring your best patient, and I'll and I'll determine what this person really can and cannot hear because he hadn't actually done that. So a week later, this wonderful woman from the Central Valley in California comes into my laboratory. Meanwhile, I spent a whole week preparing. I had help from a scientist who was from a professor in music at San Francisco State. We created all of these things and had put this woman through her paces, and I could not believe what she heard with this stupid device. I mean, she was amazing. And in fact, what I understood was that she had this, it was a device that just, very broadly excited the hearing nerve. But what we realized is that she had hearing from this single shocking electrode that was equivalent to the lowest frequency channel of a speech translational device in the communication industry called a baseband vocoder. And
what is it called?
It's a little bit complicated, baseband vocoder. But suffice to say, people in the communication industry had tried to say, well, how much can we reduce speech, simplify it, so that in some relatively small number of information channels, the speech we can convey it, transmit it, so speech is still intelligible. Because they were very interested in reducing the information and still have the speech be understandable. And they came up with the extreme form, which is a baseband vocoder. And the lowest frequency channel represented all sounds pretty faithfully up to a kilohertz. And then it took 5 higher bandpass channels centered around different sound frequencies, and speech was understandable. So in other words, if I take speech, manipulate it this way synthetically, play it to you, you'd understand what's said on your communication line, right? I realized that this woman with this device had the hardest part of this implemented. She had the baseband channel. She heard all sounds. She could tell the difference between a flute and an oboe on this baseband channel, which is amazing. So to make a long story short, I realized that actually creating a device which could represent speech as understandable in a patient was probably possible. And so I created a team, I assembled a team to help this guy and to help other surgeons at UCSF, engineers and scientists and psychologists. And we got research grants from the government, and we created a model of this device that ultimately evolved into one of the commercial forms of modern cochlear implant.
And what is the company called?
The company is called Sonova, and that's a company which is now, it's gone through several generations. Advanced Bionics was the company we licensed to, which were purchased by a company called Sonova, which is Swiss-based.
So that was your audio eureka moment. We're going to come back in part 2. We're going to talk a little bit more about brain plasticity and your work in that field. So join us next time for part 2 of our conversation with Dr. Merzenich. And if you missed any of our shows, you can watch them on our YouTube channel. Thank you for watching.
This program is made possible by Zoho Corporation.